He was an FBI agent banished to this cabin destined to be forgotten, a man shattered running from the ghosts of a mission that had failed him. There he found her, a mother, at the edge of death, and she was not by herself. What this broken man did next will restore your faith in second chances. Before our story truly begins, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments section below. And if you believe deep down that no soul, human or animal, should ever be left to perish alone in the cold, then hit that subscribe button, because this story may just reaffirm your belief in miracles. The snow in Aspen didn't just fall. It declared war. It didn't descend in flakes, but in horizontal torrents of blinding white. A relentless barrage driven by a wind that screamed down from the peaks of the Elk Mountains. This far into the back country, miles away from the sparkle and champagne of the ski resorts, the entire world was stripped down to its bare essentials: woodstone and the suffocating isolation of the raging storm. Inside a rented log cabin, shielded from the gale by thick timber and double-paned glass, Special Agent Kalen "Kale" Vance stared into the flames, pretending the mandatory leave wasn't just a hollow excuse for a suspension. He was 34 years old, but in the fire's flickering light, his face seemed ancient, worn by a weight far heavier than time. He had the lean, coiled frame of a field agent built on regimen and pure adrenaline, but his eyes, a piercing gray that once missed absolutely nothing, were hollow, fixed on the hypnotic waltz of the flames. They were eyes that hadn't known true sleep in 6 weeks. Not since the Denver operation. Not since hearing this click of the detonator, the acrid smell of ozone, and the sight of one small red sneaker under a mountain of rubble. His failure was a cold, immovable stone in his gut, and he came to Aspen to feel as cold and as isolated as that truth. He was here to do absolutely nothing, to feel absolutely nothing, to simply wait until the Bureau's psychiatrist cleared him for duty, a verdict he had long stopped believing in himself. The cabin was dead silent, save for the wind's roar and the crackle of burning logs. Kale lifted his coffee mug, the liquid inside long since cold, but he drank it anyway. He was meant to be engaging with his surroundings just as the therapist had told him, but his surroundings were a sterile, empty white, a perfect reflection of the storm raging inside his head. Then he heard it. At first it was faint, just another sound in the storm's chaotic orchestra. The crack of a branch, the groan of the snowpack. He brushed it off. He was trained to analyze, to categorize, to identify any and all threats. The wind was the only threat out here. But it came again, riding a brief lull in the gale. It was a cry high-pitched, jagged, and desperate. It was organic. It was life. Kale froze his body, going rigid. His training and his trauma waged war within him. The therapist had said to avoid his triggers. The sound of helplessness was the single greatest trigger of them all. It was the sound that echoed in his nightmares. The sound of the child he had not been fast enough to reach. "Leave it," a part of his mind commanded. "It's the wilderness, it's nature. It is not your problem. You are done solving problems." He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his hands hard into their sockets. But the sound came again, weaker this time, almost a final plea. It wasn't just pain, it was despair. And Kalen Vance, broken or not, knew that sound intimately, because he was biologically incapable of ignoring a soul in despair. With a low curse, he launched himself from the chair, the sudden movement sending embers scattering across the hearth. He moved with the swift, practiced precision of his training. He pulled on his insulated snow pants, zipped the heavy-duty parka, and settled a thermal beanie firmly over his head. He checked the tactical flashlight on his belt, fully charged, and pulled on thick, insulated gloves. The moment he opened the cabin door, the storm struck him like a fist. The wind stole the air from his lungs, while the snow became a solid wall, stinging his skin like 1,000 needles. The temperature had plummeted to single digits, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling his collar tighter against the bite. He stepped off the porch and plunged to his thighs in a fresh snowdrift. The world beyond the cabin's small island of light was a chaotic masterpiece of swirling white and screaming black. He cast his flashlight into the abyss, its powerful beam fighting to cut through the oppressive density of the blizzard. He forged ahead toward where he prayed the sound had come from, climbing uphill away from the deceptive safety of the river valley. Each step was a brutal fight, his boots shattering the icy crust to sink into deep powder. The sound was gone now, completely swallowed by the shrieking wind. Had he imagined it? Was the war in his head finally creating ghosts in the snow? He stood still listening, holding his breath against the searing cold. Nothing. Only the unrelenting wind. He was about to turn back to retreat to the fire, and the familiar failure he understood, when he heard it one last time. It was no longer a cry. It was a low, guttural moan, the sound of complete surrender, and it was terrifyingly close. He battled through a thicket of snow-laden pines, their branches dumping a crushing load of white onto his shoulders. The beam of his flashlight then fell upon a scene that stopped his heart. There, in a small depression she'd clawed from the snow, was a dog. But she was not just any dog. She was a magnificent, purebred German shepherd, a female. Her coat was a rich sable of black and tan, now horribly matted with ice and dark, steaming blood. Her amber eyes fixed on his light were intelligent and blazing with defiant agony. She was trapped not in some simple snare, but a poacher's steel trap. A wolf trap illegal and monstrous in this state. Its serrated steel jaws were clamped shut with brutal finality. It had crushed her right foreleg. He could see the limb was broken, bent at an angle that defied nature itself. The serrated teeth had torn deep, weeping wounds into muscle and tendon as blood pulsed weakly, staining the snow around her, a sickening, vibrant crimson. The bone mercifully was not exposed, but he knew it was shattered beneath the skin. She had clearly been there for hours, fighting, trying to chew herself to freedom, exhausting her soul against the unyielding steel. She let out a deep thoracic growl as Kyle took a cautious step closer. It was a sound that vibrated with pain, but resonated even more with warning. "Stay back." He raised his hand slowly, palm open. The universal sign of peace he'd used 100 times on men. "Easy," he said, his voice low and calm, the one he reserved for high ledges and barricaded rooms. "I see you. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog, this brave mother, didn't relax, but her growl softened to a low rumble. Her gaze then flickered from his face to something beside her. Kyle shifted his light, and his breath caught in his lungs. Huddled to her stomach was a desperate search for a warmth now rapidly escaping. Were 3 fragile forms, 3 tiny, trembling pups. They were so new, their eyes were sealed shut, their sparse coats wet and slick. There were no cries, only faint, pitiful mews swallowed by the shivers racking their bodies in the killing cold. They were dying. Their mother was freezing, her life's blood staining the snow. She possessed just enough strength to shield them, but none left to save them. Kel's gaze shifted from the pups to their mother, and the wall he'd built inside himself began to crumble. This wasn't a problem to be solved. This was a crisis to be managed. And a certainty settled in his soul he was not leaving them. Denver had been a lesson in helplessness. But this was a chance to finally fight back. There was no real choice. Colin Vance's training was absolute secure stabilize act. To abandon them, even for the 5 minutes required, would be a betrayal, a ghost of the very failure that exiled him here. The mother's amber eyes followed him, a silent weight on his conscience, burning with a silent, agonizing plea. "I'll be right back," he vowed, the words ripped from his lips by the howling wind. It was a promise made to her, but a vow he swore to himself. He turned, driving himself back into the heart of the storm. He ran, legs pumping through the deep tracks he'd just carved. 100 yards away, the cabin's light was a distant, desperate hope, an impossible stretch of ground. The cold was nothing. There was only the crushing weight of time running out. He exploded through the door, the storm slamming it shut behind him. There was no time to strip off his snow-caked gear. His target was the heavy-duty utility chest by the woodshed. He threw it open. Underneath jumper cables and a hatchet lay the bolt cutters. Heavy oiled steel built to break chains. Tonight they were a tool for forging a new destiny. He seized them, and in less than 30 seconds he was back outside, swallowed again by the white chaos. She was still there, a dark shadow against the white. Her head was lower now. The pups, they were terrifyingly quiet. He fell to his knees, beside her, ignoring the faint, defiant growl in her chest. "This is going to hurt," he warned her softly, wedging the steel jaws of the cutters into the trap's mechanism. "Stay still," he commanded, setting the tool in place. His gloved hands fought for a grip on the frozen steel. He squeezed, pouring all his weight, all the strength of his shoulders into the handles. The steel protested with a groan. A sharp, strangled cry tore from the dog as the pressure shifted on her shattered leg. "Almost," Cale breathed, repositioning his hold to find the mainspring. He heaved again, one single violent surge of strength. A deafening crack echoed as the tension bar shattered and the trap's jaws flew open. The sudden freedom was agonizing. The shepherd let out a scream, a sound that sliced right through Cale's soul, lashing out weakly at nothing before she collapsed, her body convulsing in the snow. She was free of the trap, but not from the grip of death. They were out of time. He tore open his parka. "I'm taking them," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold, professional calm. The mother raised her head, baring her teeth in one final, desperate act of defiance. Cale did not hesitate for a second. He gently scooped the 3 freezing pups into his hands and swiftly secured them inside the warmth of his jacket, zipping them against the life-giving heat of his own body. They weighed almost nothing. "Now it's your turn," he promised her. He slid his arms under the GSD, one supporting her chest, the other her hips, so careful to avoid the shattered leg. She had to be 60 pounds, a dead weight of sheer misery. A low warning rumble escaped her, but she was too exhausted to resist. He rose, lifting her body, a heavy, limp weight against his. The trek back was its own unique circle of hell. He carried nearly 80 pounds of life, fighting the raging wind, blinded by snow, desperately trying to protect the broken limb dangling in his arms. As he finally kicked the cabin door open and stumbled inside, it was not just a feeling of relief. It was the first flicker of purpose he'd felt in months. He laid her gently down upon the thick woolen rug by the hearth. The fire's warmth began to seep into her fur. He unzipped his parka and gently placed the 3 newborn pups beside her. They were barely moving, their tiny bodies chillingly slick and cold. The mother instantly pressed her nose against them, licking frantically in a desperate attempt to clean them, warm them, and will them to live. "Okay," Cale said, stripping off his soaked gloves and parka. "My turn." He moved to the bathroom and returned with his tactical field medical kit. This was no standard first aid box, but his own operational kit. Black nylon organized with absolute military precision. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, suture kits, antiseptics, and rolls of compression bandages. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew how to stop bleeding and stabilize a compound fracture. First, he brought over a bowl of lukewarm water. The shepherd watched him, her eyes hot with suspicion as he set it down. She completely ignored it. Her entire focus was on her pups. "You need to drink," he urged, but she wouldn't move. He knew he couldn't wait. He knelt beside her leg. The GSD instantly stiffened, a growl building. "Hey, listen to me," Cale said, his voice dropping into that calm, authoritative tone. "I know this hurts, but this wound, it'll kill you if I don't clean it. I have to do this." He gently took a roll of gauze. "I have to muzzle you. It's just for a moment. Don't fight me." He looped the gauze around her snout, quickly and efficiently tying the knot behind her ears. She whined, protesting, her paws scratching weakly, but she simply didn't have the strength to resist. Cale then switched on his tactical headlamp, flooding the wound with stark, clear light. It was bad. The trap had torn deep, ragged lacerations in the flesh, and the leg was clearly broken, the bone shifting sickeningly beneath the skin, though a small mercy it had not torn through. He worked with speed. His hands, which had trembled holding a coffee cup that morning, were now perfectly steady. He flushed the wounds with antiseptic, cleaning away the dirt and frozen blood. The dog shuddered, a sharp whine rising in her throat. He stitched the deepest of the gashes, his movements both quick and precise, laying down neat black sutures to close the tissue. Then he straightened the leg as gently as he could manage. A muffled cry came from behind the muzzle. I know. Shh, it's done. He then took 2 thick pieces of kindling from the wood box to serve as splints. Padding them with gauze, he wrapped the entire limb from paw to elbow in a tight compression bandage. The work was crude but solid. The bleeding had stopped. Bia. He cautiously untied the muzzle. The shepherd panted, exhausted, her body shaking from the shock and the pain. But she didn't bite. She just stared up at him, utterly exhausted and confused. He nudged the bowl of water closer once more. This time she lowered her weary head and drank in long, desperate gulps. Kyle finally let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, sinking back onto his heels. The mother was stable, but her pups were fading fast. His gaze swept over their tiny forms. They were warm now, but terrifyingly still, making no effort to crawl toward their mother for life. They were simply too weak, hanging on the very edge. The mother Athena, as he'd started calling her, knew it too. A faint whimper escaped her. She nudged the smallest of the litter, a little female, with her nose, but the pup remained completely unresponsive. A heartbreaking, low growl of grief rumbled deep in her throat. She looked up at Kyle, her amber eyes locking with his. In that instant, the barrier between man and beast dissolved. They were just 2 souls in a storm, watching life threaten to slip away. Then she did something that stopped his heart. With an astonishing gentleness, she used her nose, and with great purpose pushed the smallest, weakest pup from her side directly toward his hand. It was a transfer, an absolute surrender, a desperate, silent plea. Kyle's throat went tight. Okay, he whispered, his voice thick. Okay, I get it. He moved toward the kitchen. He knew this cabin held emergency storm provisions. Tucked in a back cupboard, he found it. It was a container of powdered milk. He mixed a small amount with warm water from the kettle on the stove, carefully testing the temperature on his wrist until it felt just right. He had no bottle, so he grabbed a clean dishcloth, cutting a small strip from its edge. He knelt down again. The mother watched her breathing shallow, every ounce of her being focused on him. Kyle dipped the strip of cloth into the warm milk and gently touched it to the mouth of the pup she had entrusted to him. The pup was limp and lifeless. Come on, he murmured. He squeezed a single precious drop onto its lips. For a long moment, nothing. Then, a tiny pink tongue flickered out, tasting the milk. He touched the cloth to its mouth again, and the pup's instinct took over as it began to suckle. Its mouth worked weakly against the fabric. He held steady, feeding it drop by precious drop until its tiny belly was slightly rounded. He moved to the second and then the third, and each of them drank. When he was finally done, he nestled the pups back against their mother's warm belly. She offered a single lick to his hand, a rough, warm, grateful touch, before her head fell, finally surrendering to an exhausted sleep. The storm raged for 2 more days, cocooning them in a fortress of wind and snow. The isolation Kyle had once sought out as a protective shield now became a burden they all had to share. Their whole world was reduced to the 800 square feet of the cabin, the rhythmic crackle of the fire, and the demanding new schedule of survival. Kyle's operational focus, honed by years of FBI fieldwork, snapped sharply back into place. His own trauma, the ghosts of Denver, hadn't vanished. They were just shoved into the background by the immediate, desperate needs of the living. He established a strict routine. Every 3 hours he was up. First the pups. He'd mix the powdered milk with warm water, soak the small strips of cloth, and patiently feed each of the 3 shivering little bodies. They were stronger now. Their suckling instinct was fierce and demanding. The smallest one, the female he'd first attended to in the snow, was the most aggressive of all, latching onto the cloth with a tiny squeaking growl. He decided to call her Spitfire. The 2 males were larger and calmer. After each feeding, he'd gently rub their bellies to stimulate them, his large, scarred hands performing the task with an awkward tenderness. Then his focus shifted to the mother. He would check her water, then carefully replenish her food. A mixture of canned stew and jerky he'd found in his pantry. And then came the hardest part, the medical inspection. She now watched him with a startling intelligence. She was no longer just some dog. She was an individual. Her deep amber eyes, sharp and analytical, tracked his every single move. She never truly relaxed, yet she no longer growled at his approach. She had accepted his presence as essential for her puppy's survival. On the 3rd morning, the blizzard had finally calmed into a dense, silent snowfall that muffled the world. It was time to inspect the splint. "Okay, girl," Kale murmured, approaching with caution. "Got to see how we're doing." As he knelt, she tensed, the muscles across her powerful shoulders coiling tight. He didn't muzzle her this time. It was a gamble, a test of the delicate truce they'd built. He began to gently unwrap the outermost layer of the compression bandage. He worked with methodical slowness, his hands moving with the same precise calm he used to defuse explosives. He searched for the warning signs, the taut puffiness of severe swelling, the angry red streaks of infection, the foul odor of decaying tissue. When he finally exposed the sutures he'd sewn, his breath caught in his throat. The skin was clean. It was healing. The antiseptics, the warmth, and her own staggering resilience had kept the infection from taking hold. Good. He breathed mostly to himself. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" He repositioned the kindling splints and wrapped her leg once more, ensuring it was secure, but not cutting off her circulation. She endured the whole process with a stillness that was almost human. Her head held high, her gaze fixed upon her pups. She was a queen, a warrior tolerating this indignity for the sake of her bloodline. He leaned back, utterly drained, and he looked at her. The name came to him in that moment clear and undeniable. She wasn't just a dog or a mother. She was a guardian, a survivor, and she possessed a cold, strategic intelligence he recognized in his own former colleagues. "Athena!" he said out loud. The dog's ears, which had been pressed flat, flickered and swiveled towards him at the sound. "Goddess of wisdom and warfare. Seems about right." Athena just watched him, her tail giving a single, hesitant thump against the wooden floor. It was the first sign of acknowledgement he'd seen that wasn't rooted in either food or fear. The routine became their new normal. The cabin, once a sterile container for his isolation, now pulsed with life. The silence was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his failure, but filled with the tiny, insistent squeaks of puppies beginning to crawl, their eyes finally cracking open into blurry, inquisitive blue slits. Kale found himself talking. It began with simple commands. "Stay, Athena. Easy." But the isolation and the dog's non-judgmental presence began to wear down his defenses. The therapy he'd paid a fortune for in Denver failed because he couldn't bring himself to speak. Now he could. He would sit by the fire cleaning the feeding cloths and simply talk. "You know, the report said I missed the secondary signal." He spoke into the quiet one night, staring deep into the flames. Athena watched from her rug head cocked. "They said I should have waited for the tactical report." But I heard the kid. I heard him cry. He rubbed his face, the memory scraping him raw from the inside out. "The breach order." It was my call. The bomb was under the floorboards wired to the door. I gambled on a pressure plate, simple, clean ore, and I missed it. He met Athena's stare, her gaze a steady anchor. I got my team out, but the hostage. "The boy," he couldn't say the rest. Athena whimpered as if feeling the sudden hollowness in his voice. He had drowned in that moment for 6 weeks. To finally say it aloud, even to a dog, was like breaking the surface for air. This task of caring for creatures more helpless than him became his own inverted therapy. By stabilizing them, he found he was stabilizing himself. His very own hands, which trembled with the ghosts of his past, were now steady as he stitched and splinted. His mind, once trapped in a loop of failure, was now anchored to formulas, feeding schedules, and antiseptic solutions. He was saving all of them, and it was the only thing that made any sense. A week after the rescue, a breakthrough occurred. He'd just finished feeding the pups when he collapsed into the armchair, the round-the-clock exhaustion finally pulling him under. His nightmares were usually a chaotic flood of noise, the breach, the blast, the screaming, but this time he sank into a deep, dreamless quiet. He didn't know how long he was out, but he was woken by something new. A touch. It wasn't the jarring ring of a phone or the harsh knock of a superior. It was a gentle, insistent pressure on his hand, which dangled over the chair's arm. He jolted awake, heart hammering, his training screaming. Threat. But the feeling was wrong. Kyle opened his eyes and stared. Athena was standing. She was on 3 legs, her splinted right foreleg held carefully off the floor, but she was up. She had crossed the 6 feet from the hearth to his chair, her movements completely silent. She was looking at him, her amber eyes clear, steady. He'd fallen asleep on watch, a cardinal sin in his world, and she hadn't exploited his weakness. She hadn't gone for the food. She hadn't tried to escape. She had come to him. She nudged his hand again, a wet nose pushing into his palm. This wasn't a plea for food or a demand. It was a connection, a deliberate, conscious act of acknowledgement. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand and rested it on her head, scratching gently behind her ears. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, letting out a low, rumbling sigh. And for the first time, Kyle felt a fractured piece of his soul settle into place. She trusted him. 10 days post-rescue, a fragile quiet had returned to the world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of impossible brilliant white under a piercing blue Colorado sky. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was an operational garrison. Kyle's life, once aimless, was now dictated by the demanding, rhythmic needs of 3 growing pups and 1 healing mother. Athena's splint was holding. She now moved about the cabin with a determined 3-legged limp, her injured leg held stiffly off the floor. The pups, led by the audacious Spitfire, had become a tumbling, squeaking force of chaos, exploring every corner of the cabin. Kyle, meanwhile, felt the dense fog of his PTSD receding, replaced by the sharp, immediate focus of a guardian. He was rinsing the cloths for the pups in the sink when the sound tore through the silence. It was an alien sound, a violation of the mountain's sacred quiet. It was the piercing shriek of a 2-stroke engine. In a heartbeat, the sanctuary was shattered. Athena, ever watchful, heard it first. She froze in the middle of the room, her head snapping up, ears pricked forward. A deep, resonant growl rumbled from the core of her chest, a sound that transported Kale back to the very night he'd saved her. With a determined limp, she moved swiftly to the whelping box he'd built by the fire, standing guard over her pups, her body a living shield. Kale's own training ignited in his veins, a threat. He was isolated, exposed, and a stranger was closing in. He moved silently to the window, his eyes scanning the winter landscape. A heavy-duty snowmobile clawed its way up the track to his cabin, a massive uniformed figure straddling the machine. Kale watched as the machine fell silent, and the man dismounted. He was a mountain of a man, not just tall but broad, as if carved from the very granite of the peaks around them. Kale's breath caught in his throat. He knew that uniform. Pitkin County Sheriff. Kale's focus shifted instantly to Athena. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his hand a steady presence on her shoulder. She held her ground, the growl softening to a low, warning hum. "Stay." Then, a heavy knock from a booted fist thundered against the door. Kale centered himself with a single breath, straightened his shirt, and swung the door open. The man on his porch blotted out the light, filling the entire doorframe. He stood an easy 6'4", his face weathered by the elements with sun-crinkled blue eyes and a thick gray mustache. He wore the standard-issue brown sheriff's parka, his badge glinting on his chest. The name tag read, M. Cole. Cole. He looked Cale over his gaze, sharp and assessing, taking in Cale's exhausted eyes, his tactical pants and the quiet order of the cabin behind him. "Agent Kalen Vance," the man asked, his voice a low gravel used to command. "That's me," Cale confirmed. "Sheriff Marcus Cole," the man stated, introducing himself but not offering a hand. "I'm the local authority up here. Mind if I come in? It's a long haul from town." It wasn't a question. Cale stepped aside. Sheriff Marcus "Mark" Cole crossed the threshold, bringing the sharp scent of winter and engine exhaust with him. He stomped the fresh powder from his immense boots onto the welcome mat, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. His gaze swept the cabin in a single practiced motion. Cale recognized it instantly. It was exactly what he would do: assess the occupant, search for weapons probe for any sign of instability. Mark's eyes clocked the spotless kitchen, the perfectly stacked firewood, the orderly medical kit on the table, and the bone-deep weariness yet undeniable stability of the agent himself. "The bureau liaison down in Denver gives us a heads up when one of you is in our jurisdiction on leave," Mark said, his tone deceptively casual, but his eyes were all business. "Especially this kind of leave. Just a courtesy check. Vance, making sure you're not planning on, checking out early or starting a forest fire." The words were blunt, but delivered with cold professionalism. "I'm fine, Sheriff," Cale replied, his voice devoid of emotion as he leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. "Just soaking up the quiet." Mark gave a slow nod, his gaze drifting to the crackling fire. "It's quiet, all right. Some folks can't take it. The silence starts screaming." He took another step into the room. "Cabin looks good. You look functional. That's good to see." He appeared ready to conclude his assessment, maybe offer a gruff piece of advice, and then be on his way. And in that moment the silence shattered. From the whelping box concealed behind the armchair, a single sharp yelp pierced the air. Mark Cole went still as stone. The casual concern on his face evaporated in an instant, replaced by the hardened mask of authority. Cale saw his hand not reaching for his sidearm, but resting calmly on his belt. He was in absolute control. "What was that?" Mark demanded, his voice no longer casual, but sharp as tempered steel. Cale remained motionless. He knew the unwritten law between agents: you never lie to a fellow officer. "It's a situation under my control, Sheriff." Mark's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Step aside, Agent Vance." Cale's body went rigid. This was his home, his sanctuary, and his responsibility. But Mark represented the law here, and Cale's own career was hanging by a thread. Hesitantly, Cale stepped away from the counter, revealing the hearth. The sheriff advanced 2 paces, and then stopped dead in his tracks. His gaze was fixed. Before him lay a magnificent, purebred German shepherd. He saw her poised in a vigilant, protective stance over 3 healthy, wriggling pups. And then his eyes locked onto the expertly applied tactical-grade splint on her right foreleg. His eyes flicked from the leg to Cale, and back again. "I see," he said, the 2 words heavy with meaning. As he moved closer, Athena bared her teeth, a silent, stark warning. Mark halted instantly. He was no fool. "That's one hell of a dog, son. And one hell of an injury." He turned to face Cale, his expression a perfect mask. "Start talking." So Cale told him, keeping it brief and to the point. Just the facts. The storm, the sound, the trap, the pups, the rescue. He omitted the part about his own battles, about how this little family was rescuing him. Mark listened, not saying a word. When Cale finished, the sheriff stood in silence for a long minute, his eyes fixed on their mother and her pups by the fire. "I sympathize, Vance. I truly do. You did a good thing here," he said at last. "But the good deed is done, and now the law takes over." His face hardened once more. I recognize that trap. It's an illegal poacher's rig, which means as far as this county is concerned, that dog is a stray. She has no registration, no vaccinations, and she isn't spayed. And from the looks of it, she's wild, which means you are legally harboring a potentially dangerous animal. Cale's jaw clenched. She's not dangerous, she's a mother. She's hurt. Mark just shook his head. That's exactly what makes her dangerous. A mother protecting her young is the most dangerous creature on this mountain. You included. What if she had turned on you? What if she's carrying rabies? You're a federal agent, Cale. You know better than this. By the book, I have to report it. I have to call animal control. They'll come up here. Assess her. Do you have any idea what that really means? Cale shot back, his voice a low, furious growl. She's a wild German shepherd with a serious leg injury. They'll put her down, Mark. They'll euthanize her and ship the pups off to a shelter. Mark met his stare, his blue eyes cold and unyielding. That is the procedure. It's by the book. It's the law. It's not my job to like it. It's my job to enforce it. He studied Cale, seeing the desperation and maybe something more. Something he recognized in himself. He released a long, heavy sigh, his breath misting in the cold air. Damn it, he muttered, his eyes shifting back to Cale, then to the family by the fire. I'm not gonna do that to you, or to her. Not today. He reached up and tapped the radio on his shoulder. My radio's breaking up. Must be the altitude, he said, but his eyes were locked on Cale. I'm heading back to town. I have a stack of paperwork that'll take me exactly 2 days to clear. That's 48 hours, Vance. His voice dropped to a grave, chilling whisper. You have 48 hours to fix this. You're a Fed. You know the way this works. You get a vet up here. You get her registered. You get her shots. You make her 100% legal. Or you make the call to animal control yourself. But when I come back up here in 48 hours, this situation had better be gone. If it's not, my report gets filed. And that report isn't just going to get that dog killed. It's going to get you fired. Do I make myself clear, Agent? The slam of the cabin door echoed in the sudden silence louder than the storm had ever been. Colin Vance stood motionless, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood. The 48-hour ultimatum was ticking down in his head like a bomb. Sheriff Mark Cole was gone, leaving the impossible weight of the law behind. 48 hours. A harsh, dry laugh escaped Cale, sounding foreign in the small cabin. Make her legal. He walked to the window, watching Mark's snowmobile become a black speck against the vast, hostile white. How could he possibly make her legal? He was 5 miles from a plowed road in the dead of a Colorado winter. No veterinarian would make a house call up here. Not on foot, not for some stray. And even if he could somehow get her down the mountain, a move that would surely maim her or kill her from stress what was waiting for them. A cinder block room, a county shelter. He knew the procedure. He was a man of procedure. They would see a wild animal, terrified and defensive. An unregistered German shepherd with a severe, costly injury. They would thank him, have him sign a form, and she would be euthanized within the hour. The pups, if they were lucky, would just be sent to the foster system. They were still far too young to survive. The thought was a physical sickness, a cold echo of the failure in Denver. He had followed procedure that day. He had waited for the tactical report, just like the manual said. He had hesitated, and that hesitation cost a life. Now the law was demanding the same from him again. Follow the rules, make the clean choice, and sentence this entire family to death. He turned and looked toward the hearth. Athena watched him, her head tilted. She had been tense since Mark's departure, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Her amber eyes were more than just animal. They were intelligent, assessing. She had trusted him when she lay dying. She trusted him with her puppies. She had nudged his hand in the dark, a silent acknowledgement that breached the walls of his trauma in a way no therapist ever could. To turn her in now wasn't just abandonment. It was a betrayal. It was an execution. And it would be a final admission that at his core he was a man who failed. He couldn't. He simply wouldn't. His career, his medical leave, his fitness for duty, none of it mattered more than this. Mark had given him 48 hours to solve the problem. He was right about one thing. Cale was a federal agent. He wouldn't solve the problem by the book. He would solve it by going dark. His mind, foggy for weeks, suddenly snapped into sharp, crystalline focus. The lethargy of his trauma evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear purpose of his training. His mind raced with the cold calculus of a field agent plotting an extraction. He couldn't stay. This cabin was exposed. Mark was coming back. He needed a new fortress secure, hidden, self-sufficient, and more important than anything, a place where Mark could not and would not follow. He moved to the large topographical map on the wall, the one he had memorized in his first days here. His gaze swept across the ridges and valleys, tracing the blue veins of creeks and the red lines of marked trails. Mark would patrol those trails. He'd always take the easy route. But Cale's eyes drifted northeast, away from the valley, following a faint dotted line that disappeared near a high-altitude ridge. The map named it Elk Creek Lookout, a ghost. He remembered the file from when he requisitioned the cabin. It was an old U.S. Forest Service station built in the 70s for spotting fires, decommissioned in the late 90s. It was a shell of stone and timber, miles from any real path accessible only on foot. It would have no power, no plumbing, and no one to find them. It was perfect. The decision was made. It was utter madness. Moving a critically injured dog and 3 pups, not even 2 weeks old, 5 miles through high-altitude snow. But it was the only choice. The 48-hour clock was a lie. The real clock was now. The light, steady snowfall that began this morning was their salvation. It would cover their tracks. He moved with an explosive speed that startled Athena, who rose on 3 legs with a low, questioning whine deep in her throat. "It's okay, girl," he said, his voice the calm, steady tone of a mission briefing. "We're moving to a new garrison." He grabbed his large tactical backpack, the one engineered for multi-day operations in hostile territory. He emptied it of his own gear and began packing what truly mattered. First, the puppies. He lined the insulated compartment with a thick wool blanket, creating a warm, dark haven. One by one, he gently lifted Spitfire and her brothers, tucking them deep inside.
"Son."
Temporary. He promised, his voice a low murmur against their tiny squeaks of protest. He zipped the pack almost shut, leaving a small, secure opening for air. Next, Athena's leg. He checked the splint. It was holding, but it would never survive a 5-mile trek. He grabbed a full roll of waterproof medical tape from his kit and started reinforcing it, wrapping the entire splint from her paw to her elbow until it was a rigid, protective cast. Athena stood with a profound patience, as if she understood everything. He packed the rest, the tack kit, the bolt cutters, every ounce of powdered milk, a bag of his own protein bars, and Jerky his fire-starting kit, 2 lighters, and 1 more blanket. He was ready. He stood shrugging the immense weight of the pack onto his back. He could feel the faint, warm stir of the pups against his spine. He knelt down in front of Athena. "This is it. I am not letting them have you, but you have to walk, and you have to trust me completely. But you have to stay with me no matter what." She looked at him, then to the backpack where she heard her pups, and her eyes returned to his. She licked his chin. A single rough, resolute gesture. She was committed. Cale opened the cabin door. The bitter cold rushed in, and the soft, steady snow drifted across the floor. Athena limped to the edge of the doorway, her ears laid flat, uncertain of the harsh world beyond. "With me, Athena. Come on." He stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking into the fresh powder. She paused for only a heartbeat, then followed her splinted leg dragging behind her, but holding strong. He didn't look back. He cut around the cabin past the silent woodshed and forced his way into the deep, untouched snow of the woods, forging a path northeast. A rising wind clawed at their tracks, erasing their passage almost as quickly as they carved it. One solitary man, a fugitive from his own country, guiding a wounded mother whose 3 precious lives were sheltered on his back, vanishing into a white oblivion, The journey to the Elk Creek Lookout was a 5-mile climb through a frozen hell. Cale pushed forward with relentless, punishing pace of an operator racing against time, the weight of the pups in his backpack. A fragile, precious burden. At his side, Athena fought onward, her determination a tangible force. She limped, she stumbled, she hauled her splinted leg through the deepening snow, yet she never once cried out, and she never gave up. Her gaze remained fixed on the backpack, on the sound of her children. After 2 punishing hours, they finally reached the clearing. The lookout stood as a squat stone and timber box half swallowed by old deep snowdrifts. It was utterly desolate. Windows boarded the door, hanging crookedly from one hinge. Cale kicked the door clean open, revealing a single frigid room, a fine layer of snow dusting the floor, and a rusted pot-bellied stove huddled in the corner. "It's not much," he gasped, carefully sliding the pack from his shoulders. "But it's shelter." He worked with urgency, his breath a cloud. He gently placed the pups from the pack into a deep, dry corner, swaddling them in blankets. Athena collapsed beside them, utterly spent, immediately licking them, assuring herself of their survival. Cale then secured the fractured door with a length of rope. With the hatchet he'd carried, he splintered a broken chair, feeding the pieces into the stove. It took 10 long minutes, his hands growing numb, but he managed to coax a small, flickering fire to life. It offered little warmth, but it stood as defiance against the dark. He left them everything, the powdered milk, the jerky, the last of the blankets. He had to go back. He needed more fuel, needed more food, and above all else, he had to be at the main cabin in case Mark Cole showed up ahead of schedule. He couldn't risk the sheriff discovering both sanctuaries. "Guard," he commanded Athena, his voice low, laying a hand on her head. "I'll be back before dawn. Guard the pups." Athena met his gaze, her amber eyes filled with a deep understanding of the command, and she answered with a low, knowing whine. He gave her one final, meaningful look, then slipped back through the splintered door, pulling it shut behind him. The snow was coming down harder now. He was halfway back, racing down the ridge when the sky unleashed its fury. It didn't just worsen, it shattered. The wind went from mountain breeze to a ballistic howl in under 60 seconds. The temperature absolutely plummeted. The gentle snowfall became a blinding horizontal wall of white. Caught exposed on the ridge, Cale was plunged into a desperate fight for his life. This wasn't just a storm, it was a complete whiteout. In an instant, the trail was gone, relying only on his internal compass and the memory of the downward slope. He cinched his hood tight as the wind tore viciously at him, as if trying to rip him from the mountainside itself. He fought on raw survival instincts, taking over his mind, fixed on getting to the main cabin, back to safety. When he at last broke through the tree line and saw the cabin's dark silhouette, he was on the very edge of hypothermia. He slammed the door behind him, the latch catching just as a savage gust hit, rattling the entire building to its core. He collapsed against it, gasping snow and ice sliding from his parka. He was inside. He was warm, and he was utterly, cruelly trapped. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He stared blankly at the door. The sound of the wind, a shrieking jet engine just outside. He was trapped, which meant they were trapped alone miles away in a stone tomb with a broken door and a dying fire. A roar tore from Kyle's throat, a guttural sound of pure, raw frustration, and he slammed his fist into the solid log wall. He had done it. He had done precisely what he swore he wouldn't. He had failed them. This was the nightmare of Denver all over again, but infinitely worse. In Denver, he had made one bad call in a fraction of a second. Here he had meticulously engineered their doom. He had led them from a situation where they might have survived. Mark Cole was a man bound by law. He might have been open to reason, a vet could have been called, but instead he'd delivered them himself to an enemy that possessed no mercy. He had saved them from a man only to sacrifice them to the merciless wild. He began to pace a wolf in a cage. The hours crept by. The wind never ceased. It intensified, a deafening, constant roar that vibrated deep in his bones. He was warm. He had food. He was safe. And every single second of his comfort was a new form of torture. He could picture Athena standing her lonely guard by the broken door as the snow drifted inside. He could picture the fire fading, that tiny spark of warmth being extinguished, leaving only the biting cold of the stone. He could picture the pups, their fragile little bodies finally surrendering to the cold, their soft whimpers growing silent one by one. This was his doing. He had abandoned his post. He had forsaken his charges. The guilt was a living entity clawing at his throat, so much worse than the static grief of his past failure. This was happening now. This was unfolding in real time, and he was powerless. He sat in the consuming dark, the fire in his own hearth a cruel mockery of their fate. And he just waited. He couldn't sleep. He just listened to the storm and counted the seconds. Each one was a fresh accusation. The storm raged for 15 hours. It seemed impossible a blizzard could sustain such unrelenting fury. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the wind started to relent. By the first gray light of dawn, the world was utterly still, buried under 4 feet of new heavy snow. Kyle was moving before the final gust of wind died away. He didn't pack anything. He didn't bother to eat. He strapped on a pair of emergency snowshoes he'd found in the woodshed, grabbed his flashlight and a shovel, and burst out of the cabin into the cold. The world was completely unrecognizable. It was a pristine, rolling landscape of blinding white. The trees bowed low under the weight. The air was sharp and still. He plunged into it, his movements frantic and desperate. It wasn't trekking. It was like swimming through cement. The snow was waist-deep, powdery, and impossibly thick. Every single step was a monumental, soul-crushing effort. He was sweating in the frigid air, his lungs burning. His only fuel was the terrifying, sickening knot of dread deep in his gut. It took him almost 2 hours to cover the distance that had taken him half that time the night before. He kept his eyes locked on the ridge, praying with every breath. "Hold on." He muttered the words freezing on his lips. "Hold on, Athena." He finally burst through the tree line into the clearing of the lookout, and his heart simply stopped. The building was destroyed. Not entirely, but a huge ancient pine tree weighed down by ice had snapped and fallen. It had struck the corner of the small building, collapsing 1/3 of the roof. Snow was piled in a massive drift against the already broken door, but it was too late. A strangled "no" escaped his lips, then erupted into a raw, desperate scream of her name. Athena. The shovel fell from his grasp. As he clawed at the mountain of snow blocking the door, his snowshoes useless as he sank scrambling like a man possessed. He ripped the splintered door from its last hinge, stumbling into the wreckage. The cabin was utterly destroyed, the small space half swallowed by snow, debris, and the shattered bones of the roof. The stove had vanished, and the corner where he had left them. It was simply gone, crushed beneath the very heart of the fallen tree. He dug frantically, his gloved hands tearing through the chaos of snow insulation and splintered timber. "Athena Spitfire," he choked out. Then his fingers brushed against something. Wool, the blanket. He yanked it free, and an avalanche of snow cascaded away. And then he saw her. Athena, lying still on her side, her body a defiant shield curled tightly around her 3 pups, her own back taking the weight of the crushed timbers. A thick layer of frost coated her fur frozen stiff, her eyes sealed shut. She was terrifyingly still. Beneath her, the pups were motionless forms. "No! Oh God, no!" The cry tore from his throat as he reached for her neck, his fumbling fingers desperate for a pulse. She was as cold as the ice around them. But then, a tiny, shallow plume of mist escaped her nostrils. She was breathing. Hope surged through him as he frantically dug out the pups. They were rigid, icy to the touch, and completely unresponsive. But when he pressed his ear to the smallest one's spitfire, he felt it. The barest whisper, a slow, deep thrum, a heartbeat. They were alive, not gone, not yet. There was no time for shock, no time for grief or the cold weight of failure. There was only one thing that mattered, that faint, precious mist from Athena's nostrils. She was alive. And so were they. Triage. Colin Vance's mind snapped into focus. The fog of trauma vanished, replaced by the ice-cold clarity of his FBI training. He tore his parka open. The pups first. They were the smallest, the most fragile. He plunged his bare hands back into the icy debris, his gloves forgotten. He pulled out the first, tiny, stiff body. It felt more like a frozen doll than a living creature. He didn't hesitate for a second. He ripped open the thermal shirt underneath and pressed the pup directly against his skin, a desperate attempt to force his own warmth into it. He grabbed the second, then the third, tucking them inside his shirt before zipping his parka over them, creating a small, dark, warming space nestled against the beat of his own heart. They were a cold, terrifying weight against his ribs, and now for Athena. He turned back to her, his own hands numb, but the feeling was a distant concern. "Okay, girl, it's your turn." He ran his hands over her body. She was so cold, but a violent, full-body tremor had already started. It was a good sign. A sign of the fight still in her. Her body was fighting back. He checked for the splint. It was gone shattered by the impact of the tree, or by her own desperate effort to shield her pups. His careful work was destroyed. The leg was limp, the broken bone grinding sickeningly beneath her skin. A high, thin whine escaped her as his hand brushed against it. She couldn't walk. He knew it as he tried to lift her, hooking his arms beneath her chest. He remembered the 60-pound weight from their first rescue when he was strong, and she was merely exhausted. Now she was a freezing, injured, dead weight, and his own strength was already failing. He fought to stand, his legs immediately plunging hip-deep into the unforgiving snow. He had no leverage. He couldn't possibly carry her 60 pounds and the pups while breaking trail through 4 feet of fresh powder for 5 miles. It was a physical impossibility. He would collapse from exhaustion within a mile, and all of them would die. A different, slower death, just mere yards from the hope of safety. He looked down at her into those agonizing, trusting amber eyes, and a different kind of anger surged through his veins. This was not the cold despair of failure. It was a hot, bright, defiant rage. "No!" He snarled the word, a puff of white in the frozen air. "You don't get to die. I don't get to fail. Not this time." He wouldn't carry her. He would make her move. He grabbed the thick scruff of her neck, his grip like iron, ignoring her pained cry. "Up, Athena, get up!" he screamed, his voice raw, echoing in the pristine, silent clearing. He pulled, hauling her forward out of the snowy grave she had accepted. She scrambled, her 3 good legs fighting for purchase, and then collapsed again, a low moan of pure agony escaping her. Again he roared. This wasn't the gentle nurse. This was the FBI agent, the breacher, the man who kicks down doors. He was dragging her, pulling her by the scruff, by her shoulder, anything he could get a solid grip on. "You are walking. You hear me? You are walking, or I will drag you every last inch." He turned from her and plunged his body into the deep, untracked snow, carving a trench. He'd battle forward 10 feet, a brutal swimming motion through the drifts. His snowshoes were the only thing keeping him from sinking completely. Then he would turn back, grab Athena, and haul her, whining and dragging her useless leg into the crude path he'd just forged. Then he'd do it again. 10 feet. 10 brutal, agonizing feet at a time. It was a crawl, a living nightmare. The pups were squeaking against his chest, their tiny movements a frantic reminder of the clock. Athena fell. She surrendered, collapsing into the snow trench, her eyes closing. "That's it, Asterisk," she seemed to say. "Asterisk? Let me go, Asterisk." Kyle looked down at her, and he saw the rubble in Denver. He saw the little red sneaker. He saw his own failure. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of it all. He knelt, his face an inch from hers. "You are a mother. Your children are right here on my chest. They are alive. You do not get to give up. You get up and you walk." He didn't just pull her. He hauled her to her feet, screaming at her at the mountain, at the uncaring God who had done this to them. He was a madman in the snow, a man waging a personal war on death itself. And somehow she responded. She saw the unwavering fire in his eyes, felt the life radiating from his jacket, and found a reserve she never knew she had. She stood on 3 legs. She took one step and then another. She followed him. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of screaming, pulling, falling, and crawling. 2 hours of dragging a broken leg through unforgiving ice and snow. When they finally burst from the tree line and collapsed onto the porch of the main cabin, they were both on the very edge of death. Kyle didn't stop. He kicked the door open, half dragging, half shoving Athena onto the hearth rug. And then he knew his mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Revival. He cranked the thermostat, but it wasn't fast enough. He began feeding logs into the fireplace, stuffing it, building a roaring blaze. He fed a blazing inferno until the stone hearth was scalding to the touch. The cabin grew as hot as a sauna. With the gentlest touch, he drew the 3 pups from his jacket. They were warm, their skin pink, but they were terrifyingly limp, far too weak. He carefully laid them on a towel near the fire's warmth. "Don't you dare." He whispered a prayer against the darkness. He worked all night, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He swaddled Athena in every blanket he possessed, piling them high as she shivered violently. He couldn't bring himself to touch her shattered leg. Stabilization was a luxury for the living, and she was still teetering on the edge. Then the pups. He took a rough, warm towel and began to rub them, his hands moving with desperate speed to stimulate their circulation. He mixed the powdered milk, making it profoundly warm, and forced it drop by precious drop onto their tongues with a cloth. He rubbed their chests, breathed his own warmth onto them, massaged their tiny, lifeless limbs. He became a machine caught in a desperate rotation. Stoke the fire, check on Athena, rub the pups, feed the pups. He refused to sit. He wouldn't drink. He only worked. The ghosts of Denver haunted the corners of the room, watching him, daring him to fail once more. He shut them out. He just worked. He completely lost all track of time. The dark, raging night finally surrendered to a pale gray dawn. The cabin was now stifling. Kyle was drenched in sweat, his hands raw and bleeding, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He slumped against the wall, his eyes burning with exhaustion, convinced he had failed. He had given everything he had, and then he heard it. A faint but angry squeak. He forced his eyes open. Spitfire. The smallest of them all was squirming on the towel, her legs kicking. She was alive. A heartbeat later, a brother rolled over. Then the third. They were alive. He laughed, a short, choked, almost hysterical sound of pure relief. He looked over at Athena. Her violent shivering had finally stopped. Buried in a cocoon of blankets, she had somehow found the strength to lift her head. Her amber eyes were no longer glazed over with cold. They were clear, they were sharp, and they were fixed on him. She let out a soft, exhausted, grateful whine. Kyle slid down the wall, collapsing onto the floor, his head bowed in utter relief, the adrenaline finally draining from his body. Sunlight streamed through the dirty window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The fire crackled softly. A pup squeaked. Athena sighed contentedly. They were alive, all of them. But winter was not yet ready to release its grip. It fought hard, holding the high country in a fist of ice, long after the valleys below had surrendered to green. But slowly and inevitably the great thaw began. It started not as a sight, but as a sound. The steady drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the cabin eaves, a sound that had been silenced for months on end. Then the creeks began to roar, their voices thunderous and full. The frozen world was finally cracking open. Inside the cabin, life had found a new chaotic rhythm. The three pups were no longer the fragile things they had been, shivering little lumps. They were now small, rambunctious, sharp-toothed forces of nature. Their eyes were open, a brilliant, intelligent blue-gray, and their true personalities were beginning to emerge. Spitfire, the lone female, was precisely what Kyle had named her, quick-witted defiant, and the undisputed leader of the pack. Her two brothers, whom he'd affectionately started calling Rook and Boulder, for their solid, calmer dispositions, followed her lead without question. The little cabin had truly become their den, its floor now littered with chewed-up kindling and Kyle's old socks. Athena watched over it all with a new, quiet, maternal authority. Her recovery was a stunning testament to her resilience, but it was not without its scars. After that harrowing second rescue, Kyle had been forced to reset the splint on her leg, his hands becoming a surgeon's with only tactical training to guide him. The bone had mended, but it had mended incorrectly. The leg was straight, yet the shattered joint fused at a flawed angle, leaving her with a deep, permanent limp, a life where she would never run on 4 legs again. But Kyle watched. He watched, captivated, as she adapted. She didn't mourn her loss. She compensated using her powerful shoulders and hindquarters to move. Her limp was simply a part of her new gait. She was a survivor forever marked by her trauma, but she was never defined by it. And in that imperfect healing, Kyle saw a reflection of himself learning to walk once more. He knew he would never be the same agent he was before Denver. He too would carry a limp, but he was no longer broken. As the snows finally receded, revealing the muddy track to his cabin, the harsh reality of his isolation finally came to an end. The 48-hour ultimatum from Sheriff Mark Cole had vanished in the blizzard, a threat buried by a far more immediate crisis. But the law remained. He was still a federal agent harboring an unregistered animal. For weeks he'd been completely dark, his satellite phone powered down, holding the Bureau and the entire world at bay. Now the time had come to face the consequences. He was no longer the man who buried himself in the snow. He was the man who had clawed life back from a frozen grave. He picked up the sat phone, charged it, and made the call. Not to the Bureau, but to the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office. "This is Special Agent Vance," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm at the Elk Creek cabin. I need to speak with Sheriff Cole." "Mark, it's Kyle. The situation, my guests, they're still here. I'm not running. I am not hiding them." "Danged. I just need you to come and see." A week later, a dark green county truck rumbled up the muddy, half-frozen road, and Mark Cole stepped out. He wasn't in his heavy parka, but a standard-issue uniform, his hand resting on his belt, his face an unreadable mask. He was here to do a job. Kyle stepped onto the porch, unarmed, his hands hanging loose and open at his sides. He didn't invite Mark inside. The sheriff walked past him, his eyes scanning, and stopped dead in the doorway. The cabin was a sea of puppy toys. The 3 German shepherd pups, now the size of small foxes, tumbled over each other, before freezing, staring at the stranger with a sudden, wary silence. By the hearth, Athena rose. She did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. She simply stood. Her splint was long gone, her right leg held just slightly off the floor as she looked directly at Mark. She let out a single, low woof. It was an announcement. "This is my den. This is my man. And who are you?" Mark's eyes went from the dog to her injured leg, then to the 3 healthy, bright-eyed pups. Finally, he looked at Kyle, who stood quietly by the door, ready for the handcuffs, ready to lose his badge, but never ready to apologize for what he'd done. Mark Cole stood there for a full minute, the silence broken only by the squeak of a puppy. He slowly took off his hat, running a hand over his gray mustache. "Damn it, Vance," he said, his voice soft, all the steel suddenly gone from it. "You've really made a hell of a mess here." He shook his head in a slow, tired motion. "You were supposed to call animal control." Kyle nodded. "I know what I was supposed to do, Sheriff, but I did what I had to do. I'll accept the consequences. But you can't send them to the county. You know what'll happen to them there." Mark looked at Athena again, who was now patiently sniffing his boot. Her tail offered a single, hesitant wag. Yeah? Mark breathed out a heavy sigh. I know. He settled his hat back on his head, pulling out his cell phone. You're a damn fool, Vance, but you're a good man. And the county's not the only way. His fingers tapped out a number he knew by heart. Sarah, it's Mark Cole. Yeah, it has been a while. Listen to me. Later. I'm up at that old rental on Elk Creek. I've run into a situation, a purebred female German Shepherd. Looks like she's from a working line. She has 3 pups about 9 or 10 weeks old. The mother, she had a run-in with a poacher's trap. Bad leg. No, she's not wild. Not anymore. She's with someone. Can you come out here and take a look? Yeah, he's the man who found her. Thanks, Sarah. By the next morning, Sarah had arrived. She was a woman in her 50s, lean and tall, her gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing. She pulled up in a truck, outfitted with a specialized transport crate. She was from the Mountain GSD Rescue, a private no-kill organization dedicated to rehoming working breeds. She was all business, her expert hands immediately assessing Athena's wounded leg. You're no veterinarian, she stated, her fingers tracing the hardened ridge of fused bone. But you're one hell of a field medic. Her attention then shifted to the pups, checking their teeth, their coats. They're strong, but they aren't pets. This is a high drive line. They need a job, or they'll tear themselves apart. Her gaze then fell upon Cale. I have a place, a cattle ranch up near Steamboat Springs. The owner needs guardians, dogs that will live to patrol his fence line. He'll take all 4 of them. They'll stay together. They'll have a purpose. It's the right life for them. Cale looked down at Athena at the profound intelligence shining in her eyes. She needed a purpose. Their goodbye was a silent, heavy thing. He loaded the pups one by one into the crate. Then he knelt before Athena. This is it, girl, he whispered. Your new post. She pressed her head firmly against his chest, giving his chin a single, deliberate lick. He closed his eyes, absorbing the moment, then rose and secured the crate door. 4 months later, the hum and roar of Denver traffic was a world away from the mountains. Special Agent Kalen Vance, in a pressed suit with his badge clipped to his belt, emerged from his bureau-issued sedan. He was back. His mandatory leave had ended. He'd passed the psychiatric evaluation, checking all the required boxes. The ghost still rode with him, but he was the one at the wheel now. It was his day off. He had driven 3 hours to a rolling green valley near Steamboat Springs. He stood by a weathered fence post, the air thick with the scent of hay and warm earth. He let out a sharp, clear whistle that cut through the silence. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then a single distant bark answered. He saw a flash of tan and black cresting the hill, then another and another. They came charging over the hill, Spitfire Rook and Boulder, no longer puppies, but long-legged, half-grown adolescents. Their ears were pricked, alert and alive. Every movement was filled with power. They slammed into him, a joyous, chaotic whirlwind of paws and excited licks. And then behind them came their mother, Athena. She was no longer the ghost of the snows. Her coat was a deep, shining sable, her muscles rippling with strength. She ran with a rocking, uneven, 3-legged gait, but she was impossibly fast, outpacing her own sons. Her limp was not a flaw, but a part of her stride, a testament to her unyielding will. She ran, and she was magnificent. She slowed to a perfect stop right before Cale, pressing her head hard against his chest. He dropped to his knees, burying his face in the fur of her neck, and for the first time since Denver, he felt whole again. From the porch, an old rancher in a cowboy hat watched them. A slow, knowing nod, his only comment. "She's the most brilliant guardian I've ever known," the man's voice rang out. "That limp doesn't hold her back. She just outsmarts it." A teary smile crossed Kyle's face, his eyes glistening. He watched Athena, his perfectly imperfect survivor, running wild and free across the grass. He had rescued her from the cold steel of a trap, but she and her pups had saved him from the prison of his own heart. The story of Kyle and Athena shows us that divine miracles rarely appear as we expect. We plead for the storm to simply cease. But sometimes the miracle is the strength given to us to weather the storm. Kyle thought he was broken beyond repair, but God sent him Athena to give him a new purpose. And when Athena was trapped, Kyle was sent to be her deliverance. Two broken souls sent to make each other whole. If you find yourself in the midst of a storm, never lose your faith. Your own miracle is on its way, and it might arrive as a new burden to bear, or the sudden will to take just one more step forward. If you believe God helps in mysterious ways, please write Amen in the comments below. Share this journey with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is never truly lost. And please subscribe for more inspiration. May you and everyone you hold dear be blessed.